The man's hands stopped moving the moment he saw the badge. He was mid-sentence, talking to someone beside him, and then he just stopped. His eyes dropped to my jacket lapel, where I'd pinned my grandfather's old fire department badge before leaving the house that morning. I hadn't thought much about wearing it. It was a habit by then, the same way some people wear a cross or a charm, something to carry him with me. But this man, the fire commissioner, the one everyone in the room had been angling to speak with all evening, he wasn't looking at my face. He was staring at that badge like it had said something he wasn't prepared to hear. "Where did you get that?" he asked. His voice was low, not rude, not aggressive, just careful, the way someone speaks when they're trying not to show how much something affects them. "It was my grandfather's," I said. "He passed away 2 months ago." The commissioner didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at the badge again. Then he looked at me. What was his name? When I told him, something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly. Something older than that. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "Not here." That was the moment I realized the man who raised me, the one my own mother called a disappointment, the one my uncle said had wasted his life, might have been someone entirely different from who any of us knew. My grandfather, Walter, was the kind of man people stopped noticing after a while, not because he was unpleasant, because he was so consistently, quietly present that he became part of the background, like a good chair or a reliable clock. You only noticed he was there when something needed doing. He lived alone in a small house in Denton, a town in North Texas where summer lasted too long and everyone knew your name but not necessarily your business. His yard was always neat. His truck was always clean. His refrigerator, when I stayed with him as a kid, always had sweet tea and leftover biscuits from the diner 2 blocks over. He didn't talk about himself. Not ever, really. If you asked about his past, he'd deflect so smoothly you almost didn't realize it had happened. "Oh, that was a long time ago," he'd say. Or "I don't suppose that matters much now." And then he'd ask you something about your life, and somehow 20 minutes would pass and you'd forget what you'd originally asked him. My mother didn't have patience for him. She loved him, I think, in the abstract way adult children love parents who haven't been actively cruel. But she didn't have patience for him. He wasn't wealthy. He didn't have connections. He didn't play golf or invest in things or talk about property values. He was just a retired firefighter who lived alone and didn't complain about it. He had every opportunity, she used to say, usually when she'd had a glass of wine and something had reminded her of him. He just never wanted to do anything with it. I didn't understand what she meant. Do anything with what? He'd spent 32 years in the fire service, but she'd wave it off like it was nothing, like 32 years of running into burning buildings was a hobby someone picked up between real accomplishments. My uncle was worse. He once said at Christmas dinner that Grandpa had peaked early and coasted the rest. Nobody argued with him. I was 17 and I remember looking across the table at my grandfather, who was quietly eating his pie and pretending he hadn't heard. His face didn't change, not even slightly. I was the only one who spent real time with him, not out of obligation. I genuinely wanted to be there. During summers in high school, I'd drive out to Denton and stay for weeks. We'd fix things around the house, watch old westerns, go to the hardware store more often than was probably necessary. He taught me how to change a tire and how to read a weather radar and how to make his mother's cornbread, which he insisted required a cast-iron skillet or it didn't count. He never once told me he was proud of me outright. But when I got into the EMT certification program, he drove 4 hours to be at my completion ceremony and sat in the front row with a paper cup of bad coffee and clapped louder than anyone. He was the steadiest person I knew, and my family treated him like a footnote. When he got sick, it happened fast. Congestive heart failure, the doctors said. His heart had been working too hard for too long, which felt, in retrospect, like an accurate description of his whole life. I was working a shift at the hospital in Fort Worth when his neighbor called me, a woman named Dorothy who had lived next door for 15 years and still brought him tomatoes from her garden every August. Your grandfather collapsed in the backyard, she told me. The ambulance came. He asked me not to bother anyone. That last part hit me hard. He asked me not to bother anyone. I called my mother on the way to the hospital. She said she'd see if she could get down there by the weekend. It was Tuesday. I called my uncle. He said he had a work thing he couldn't move. By the time I arrived, Grandpa was in a hospital bed looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. He smiled when I walked in, a real smile, not a polite one. You didn't have to come all this way, he said. Of course I did. He shook his head a little, like he still wasn't sure that was true. Your mother coming? She said she'd try. He nodded once and looked at the window. It's all right, he said. I know she's busy. He said it without bitterness, without self-pity. Just a plain statement of fact that made something in my chest ache in a way I couldn't explain at the time. He lived 4 more days. My mother arrived on the last afternoon, too late for him to know she was there. My uncle sent flowers. His neighbor Dorothy sat in the hallway and prayed the rosary. He died on the Thursday morning, quietly, the way he'd done most things. My mother cried at the hospital. I don't want to say she didn't grieve. I think she did in her way. But the first thing she said when it was over was, I'll call the funeral home and see what the costs look like. Which was fine. Someone had to think about logistics. But it was the only thing she said for a long time after that. The funeral was small. A few neighbors. Dorothy, one man I didn't recognize who shook my hand at the reception and said he'd served with Grandpa a long time ago and left it at that. My uncle gave a short eulogy that mentioned Grandpa's good heart twice and ran exactly 4 minutes. I counted. Afterward, I went to clean out his house. My mother said she'd help but had a meeting she couldn't reschedule, so I went alone. Most of it was ordinary. Worn furniture, books about Texas history, a coffee can full of mismatched screws, an entire drawer dedicated to rubber bands and twist ties, which made me laugh and cry at the same time. In his closet, in a shoebox on the top shelf behind an old uniform jacket, I found the badge. It wasn't his regular department badge. I knew that one had seen it on his uniform in old photos. This one was different, heavier, smaller, with a number and a marking I didn't recognize, and on the back, in tiny stamped letters, a set of initials and a date, 1987. He'd worn his regular badge every day. This one was hidden. I didn't know what it meant, but I kept it. I pinned it inside my jacket on the drive home, and for reasons I still can't fully explain, I never took it off. 3 months later, I attended a regional emergency services recognition banquet in Dallas. I was there with colleagues from the hospital, a formal dinner, the kind with cloth napkins and too many speeches about service and sacrifice. I wore the badge on my lapel without thinking much about it. It had become habit. The fire commissioner, a man named Aldridge who had spent 40 years in the service and was about to retire, was the keynote speaker that evening. I'd seen him from across the room. Tall, deliberate in his movements, the kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. I hadn't planned to speak to him. Our paths crossed near the bar during the cocktail hour, and I was about to move past him when he stopped mid-conversation and looked down at my lapel. Everything after that happened slowly. He excused himself from the man he'd been talking to. He stepped toward me. He looked at the badge for a long time without saying anything. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. "Where did you get that?" And I told him, and his expression did something I wasn't prepared for. Not shock. Recognition, the way a person looks when they see something they'd thought was gone for good. "What was his name?" he asked. When I said it, he closed his eyes for just a moment. Then he opened them. "Come with me," he said. "Please." He took me to a small room off the main hall, a coat room, mostly empty. He closed the door and stood there for a moment like he was deciding how to begin. "I knew your grandfather," he said. "He mentioned he knew some people in the service," I said carefully. "Not just people. Your grandfather was part of a specialized unit here in Texas, that operated for about 12 years, from the early 80s to the mid-90s. They weren't publicly acknowledged. Their work wasn't in any press releases or annual reports. I stared at him. What kind of work? He looked at me steadily. The kind nobody else would do. Chemical plant fires, refinery explosions, situations where if the wrong people panicked or the wrong information got out, you'd have mass casualties. Your grandfather's unit was called in when the situation was past the point of standard response. They went into places that had been declared too dangerous for regular crews. He paused. They were never officially on scene. If they failed, there was no record of them being there. If they succeeded, nothing happened, I said slowly. Exactly. My hands felt strange. I pressed them flat against my thighs. My family thought he just worked a regular station his whole career. A regular firefighter. He did on paper. The unit was a parallel assignment, completely deniable. Why? Because if it became public that we were sending men into those conditions, repeatedly, voluntarily, without hazmat documentation or official sanction, it would have exposed the state to enormous liability, and it would have terrified the public, better for everyone if it never officially existed. I thought about my uncle's Christmas dinner speech, about my mother's tired sigh whenever Grandpa's name came up in conversation. He saved lives, I said. Many, the commissioner said, and there are people walking around today who have no idea how close they came because of him and the others. Why didn't he ever tell anyone? Why didn't he? I stopped. I knew why. It was obvious. He'd been told not to, and my grandfather was the kind of man who kept his word. I didn't tell my mother right away. I drove home that night and sat at my kitchen table for a long time, turning the badge over in my hands. The number on it meant nothing to me before. Now I wondered what operation it referenced. What building? What fire? I thought about the way Grandpa used to sit on his back porch in the evenings and just look at nothing in particular. I used to think he was bored. Now I wondered what he was remembering, what he was carrying. I called a retired captain I knew from the hospital, a man who had been in fire service before he moved to emergency medicine. I described the badge. There was a long silence. I've heard of that unit, he said carefully, but officially, I've never heard of them. What does that mean? It means they were real, and it means you should be careful about who you talk to. That was all he'd say. A week after the banquet, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. The commissioner would like to meet with you again. Tuesday, 10 a.m., Northside Veterans Resource Center. Please confirm. I confirmed. The Veterans Center was a low brick building on the north side of Dallas. Nothing official about it. It looked like it had once been a dentist's office. Inside, a woman at the front desk smiled like she'd been expecting me and told me the commissioner was in the back. He was sitting in a small room with two other men, both older, both the kind of people who have spent enough time in dangerous situations that they've stopped needing to prove anything. On the table between them was a folder. "Sit down," Commissioner Aldridge said. "We'd like to tell you some things about your grandfather." They couldn't share everything. What they could share, they did. There were pages, some redacted, some not, that documented incidents between 1981 and 1993. A refinery fire outside Beaumont that would have killed dozens if the blaze had reached the secondary tanks. An industrial chemical spill near Houston that was reclassified as a contained incident before anyone got close enough to understand how bad it had been. A natural gas explosion in a residential neighborhood in San Antonio that, per official records, was handled by local crews, but wasn't. My grandfather's name appeared in the margins of one document, next to a handwritten note in someone else's handwriting, primary entry, extracted 3, secured East Corridor. I sat there and read it twice. He never said a word, I said. That was the agreement, one of the older men said. Not to his family, not to anyone. Especially not to family, the commissioner said, not unkindly. The fewer people who knew, the less chance of exposure. These men understood what they were signing up for. I thought about all the times my mother had looked at him like he was an embarrassment. All the Thanksgivings he spent alone because my uncle had decided it wasn't worth the drive. All the phone calls that went to voicemail. All the years. He died in a hospital room with 2 people, I said. His neighbor and me. Nobody said anything for a moment. The cost of that kind of service, the commissioner said finally, is that the people closest to you never have the full picture. And some of them fill in the gaps with the wrong story. That was the most careful, honest, devastating sentence I'd heard in a long time. I didn't go to my mother's house angry. I want to be clear about that, because for a long time afterward people assumed I had, that I showed up ready to scream at her, to make her feel what she deserved to feel. But that's not what happened. I drove over on a Sunday afternoon with the folder of photos I'd been given, copies, not originals, and the badge, and my grandfather's own handwriting, which I'd found in a small spiral notebook tucked inside the lining of his uniform jacket. I hadn't noticed the jacket at first. I'd assumed it was just his old work coat. But when I pulled it out to put in the donation box, something shifted inside it. I felt along the lining until I found the seam, and inside, folded very small, was a piece of paper and a page torn from a notebook. The paper said, "If you find this, then you were looking. That matters more than you know. I spent my career doing work I wasn't allowed to explain. I made my peace with that a long time ago. What I never made peace with was watching the people I loved decide I was nothing. Because I couldn't tell them I was something. That's not their fault. They were working with what they had. But if you're reading this, you have more now. Use it however you need to." I read it standing in his empty bedroom, with the afternoon light coming through the blinds, and I understood everything. My mother read it at her kitchen table with both hands flat on either side of the paper, like she was afraid it would move. My uncle had driven down when I called him. He sat across from her. Neither of them said anything for a long time after they finished. "I thought he was," my mother started. "I know," I said. "He never defended himself," she said. "Not once. Every time we—" She stopped. "He just never said anything. He couldn't." She covered her face with her hands. My uncle looked out the window. He's not someone who cries easily, and he didn't then, but something went out of him that afternoon that I hadn't seen leave him before. Some confidence, some certainty about the story he told himself. "I called him difficult," my uncle said quietly, at his own Christmas dinner. "You didn't know," I said. "I didn't try to know. That's different." The room was quiet for a long time, and in that quiet something shifted. Not fixed, not forgiven exactly, but shifted. The way a door opens slowly when someone finally reaches for the handle. My mother asked, about a week later, if she could see where Grandpa used to go when he wasn't at home. She'd found a receipt in a box of his things, the Veterans Resource Center, dated about 6 months before he died. She wanted to see it. I took her. The woman at the front desk remembered him immediately. "Walter," she said, and her face did the thing that happens when people remember someone they genuinely liked. "He used to come in Thursday mornings, sit in the corner by the window, sometimes talk to the other men. Mostly just sat." "Did he ever talk about his service?" my mother asked. The woman considered it. "He talked around it," she said, like he was describing a room without ever going inside. We stood there in the lobby and my mother looked at the framed photos on the wall. Old crews, old stations, men in gear standing in front of trucks, and I watched her see something in them that she hadn't seen before. Just people. Just ordinary people who had done extraordinary things and then come home and never talked about it. She didn't cry at the resource center. She waited until we were in the car. I let her. There was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying. Commissioner Aldridge retired the following spring. At his retirement dinner, to which he'd invited me, he gave a speech about the nature of service. He said that the work people remembered was rarely the most important work. that the most important work, by design, left no trace. He said this without looking at me, but I felt it anyway. Afterward, he handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter, handwritten, on plain paper, not official letterhead. Your grandfather was one of the finest men I've ever worked with. He was also the least demanding. He never asked for recognition, not once in 12 years. He understood that the value of what he did didn't depend on whether anyone ever knew he did it. That understanding is rarer than talent, rarer than courage. It may be the rarest thing there is. I hope you carry it forward. I believe he intended for you to. I put the letter in the same box where I'd found his notebook. The box lives on the top shelf of my closet now. Sometimes I open it and just look at what's inside. The badge, the notebook page, the letter, the folded piece of paper that started with, "If you're reading this." It doesn't feel like a box of secrets anymore. It feels like an instruction. I think about the version of my grandfather that my family had constructed. The one who was wasting his potential, the one who peaked early and coasted, the one who was difficult and secretive and vaguely embarrassing at family gatherings. I think about how completely and confidently they believed that version, and I understand it in a way. He never corrected them. He never said you're wrong about me, or you don't have the full picture, or I need you to trust me even without an explanation. He just sat quietly at Christmas dinner and ate his pie while my uncle summarized him in 4 dismissive words. Because that was what he'd agreed to, silence in exchange for the work in exchange for lives saved that would never have his name on them. He kept his end of the bargain for 32 years. Kept it while his family built a smaller, cheaper version of him in their heads and lived by it. I am still angry about that. I want to be honest about that. Not at my family exactly. I believe them when they say they didn't know, but at the situation, at the cost of it, at the idea that a person can spend their entire life doing something meaningful and still die in a county hospital room with only a neighbor and a granddaughter for company, because the work required that nobody know. That anger is mine to carry. I don't know what to do with it yet. I just know I'm not pretending it isn't there. My family changed slowly the way real change happens, not in one dramatic moment but in accumulation. Small things. My mother started calling me more often, not about logistics. Just to talk. She asked questions about Grandpa that she'd never asked before, what his laugh sounded like, whether he'd ever mentioned her as a little girl, what his house smelled like in the mornings. She was trying to reconstruct him from fragments, the way archaeologists piece together something that was buried before they arrived. My uncle went to the Veterans Resource Center on his own one afternoon. He didn't tell me until later. He said he just wanted to sit somewhere that had known Grandpa. He spent an hour there and drove home and called his own son that night, which apparently he hadn't done in 6 weeks. Small things, but they add up. My mother asked me once, about 6 months after everything, if I was ever going to take the badge off. No, I said. Does it feel strange wearing it? I thought about it. It feels like carrying something that has weight to it, but not the bad kind. She nodded slowly. I wish I'd paid attention, she said, earlier, when it would have mattered to him. It matters now, I said. She looked at me. Does it? I think so. I think he would have thought so. She wasn't sure about that. I could see it in her face, the way she turned it over, looking for the catch, waiting for the part where she'd have to accept that it was too late. But I didn't think it was. Not entirely. I thought my grandfather had left what he left for exactly this reason. Not so we could mourn him properly. So we could learn something from him while we still had time to use it. The morning I drove to Denton to put flowers at his grave. Just myself. Just a Tuesday in February, with grey light coming down flat over the highway. I stopped at the diner 2 blocks from his old house and ordered black coffee and a biscuit. The way he used to. The woman behind the counter was older. She'd been there for years. When I mentioned I was Walter's granddaughter, she set down her cloth and looked at me with an expression that had real feeling in it. He came in every Thursday morning, she said. sat at the counter, always had the same thing, always left $1 more than the bill. That sounds right, I said. He used to talk to whoever was having a hard morning, she said. I don't know how he could tell, but he always could. He'd just sit down next to someone who looked like they were barely keeping it together and ask them something ordinary. How's your week going? What are you working on? Nothing that required them to talk about what was actually wrong. Just something to keep them company for a few minutes. She shook her head. People remember that. More than they remember a lot of things. I paid for my coffee and drove to the cemetery. It was quiet the way cemeteries are quiet, not empty, but settled. His headstone was simple. His name, his years, father and grandfather. No mention of 32 years in fire service. No mention of the unit that never existed. I knelt in the grass and set the flowers against the stone and didn't say anything for a while. I brought the badge, not to leave there, I wasn't ready to part with it, but to show him, maybe, or to let it be in the same place as him for a few minutes. I thought about the letter, about the highest form of service is to leave the world better without needing credit for it, about the woman at the diner who remembered him not for anything he'd done in a burning building, but for sitting down next to a stranger who was barely keeping it together on a Thursday morning. Maybe those two things were the same thing. Maybe that's what he'd been doing his whole life. In the big ways, the dangerous ways, the ways that cost him his family's understanding and his own comfort, and the right to be known for who he actually was. And in the small ways too. The $1 on top of the bill, the biscuit recipe written out by hand and tucked into my bag before I drove home from every visit. He wasn't trying to be invisible. He just understood something most people don't, that the work doesn't need an audience to be real. I still wear the badge. People ask about it sometimes, and I tell them it was my grandfather's, and most of them nod politely and move on. Occasionally someone looks at it longer than that. Once, a retired firefighter at a conference held it carefully between 2 fingers and said, very quietly, that he'd heard of the unit. Then he handed it back and didn't say anything else. I didn't push it. Some things don't need to be pulled further into the light. What I carry now is harder to name than a badge. It's something about paying attention, about not assuming that the quiet person in the room is quiet because they have nothing to say, about not filling in the blank spaces with a story that's convenient rather than true. My grandfather spent his life as a kind of proof that service doesn't have to be seen to count. That a person can do more good in the dark than most people do in the spotlight, and still come home and make oatmeal every morning and watch old westerns and take care of whatever needed taking care of. I missed so many chances to tell him I saw that in him. I knew him better than anyone in my family, and I still missed it. That's the part I can't clean up with a good ending. The part that stays. But if you're listening to this and you have someone like him in your life, someone who doesn't ask for attention, who shows up without announcing it, who you've maybe started to take for granted because they're always just there, go find them tonight. Ask them something you've never asked, and when they start to deflect and say, "Oh, that was a long time ago," don't let them. Stay with them. Keep asking. Because the story they're carrying is one you don't want to piece together from a shoebox after they're gone. Trust me on that. I've thought a lot about why Walter never said anything. Not one word of defense. Not one quiet correction when my uncle summarized his whole life in 4 dismissive words at Christmas dinner. He just sat there and ate his pie. For a long time I thought that was sadness. Now I think it was something harder than that. It was a choice. A daily, deliberate choice to absorb the wrong story without correcting it, because correcting it would have cost something greater than his own reputation. That's the part that stays with me. The cost of it. Because here's what I've come to understand. The way you treat people has consequences that outlast the moment. My family's indifference toward Walter wasn't just unkind. It was a debt they didn't know they were running up. And when the truth came out, they had to pay it all at once. That's how it works. Not as punishment from some outside force, but as simple, unavoidable reality. Every year they dismissed him, every holiday they let pass without a real phone call, every eye roll when his name came up, All of it came back, not because life is fair, but because actions accumulate. What you choose to ignore doesn't disappear, it waits. And Walter knew that. I think that's why he wrote what he wrote. He wasn't bitter, he was honest. He understood that the people around him were making choices with incomplete information, and he'd accepted that as part of the life he'd agreed to. But he also left that note tucked into his uniform jacket because he wanted someone to eventually have the full picture. He wanted the record corrected, even if he wasn't alive to see it. That took a different kind of courage than running into a burning building. It took the courage to trust that truth has weight, and that weight doesn't just disappear when you do. What I carry from all of this isn't grief, exactly. It's more like a recalibration. I used to measure people the way my family did, by what was visible, what they'd accomplished that you could point to, what they'd built that you could see. Walter had nothing by that measure. A small house, an old truck, a badge. Nobody recognized, but the woman at the diner remembered him on the Thursday morning. Dorothy brought him tomatoes every August for 15 years, and somewhere people are alive who have no idea his name because he walked into places nobody else would go and came back without telling a soul. That's not nothing. That's everything, actually. The lesson I keep returning to is simple and uncomfortable in equal measure. The quietest people in the room often have the most to say, and the ones who don't demand your attention are frequently the ones who deserve it most. Not because silence signals virtue, it doesn't always, but because in a world that rewards loudness, the person who chooses to do good work in the dark, without an audience, without applause, without even the right to explain themselves, that person has figured out something most of us spend our whole lives avoiding. That the work is the point, not the recognition, the work. I wear his badge because I need the reminder. Some days I remember. Some days I still get it wrong. But I'm trying.